Economics and the Ecosource. So today we have Pelin Demirel. It is a pleasure to have you. So she comes from the Imperial College London. She's specialized in entrepreneurship and innovation initially, but she's working also on sustainability and innovation. And indeed, in the past, I think that we know her much more because her supervisor is Mariana Mazzucato, which is a quite well-known researcher. And so I think that this is one of the reasons that we have met at the academic level. So today we will have the presentation of the paper called R&D Tax Credits and Subsidies. And it is an application for the Chinese case study. So, thank you.
Thank you. So, can you hear me? It's working. Yeah, perfect. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for your time to attend. I know how busy everyone is, so it's really nice to have you here. Thanks so much for this introduction, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's really nice to be in Reus to meet so many new people. So thank you for inviting me. Today I'd like to present this paper about R&D tax credits and R&D subsidies, and it's focusing on the context of novelty of innovations, how R&D tax credits and subsidies affect the novelty of innovations. In emerging countries, our specific example is China, and it's a joint collaboration with two of my colleagues, Fikes from University of Leeds, and my colleague Li Xiaowu from Xiamen University, who has done most of the data because it's Chinese data. Okay. So our research question in this paper is, how do R&D tax credits and R&D subsidies affect the novelty of innovation in Chinese firms? There's a big literature that looks at whether these policy tools drive innovations, incentivize innovations. There's a very big literature, but not many people look at how they affect the nature of innovations. And in particular, we are asking, do these policy tools trigger incremental or radical innovations in the context of China? So if you're an industrial organization scholar like me, now this time is an exciting time because industrial policy is cool again. You know, we had quite a bit of time that people didn't really pay much interest or attention to industrial policies, but it's making a comeback. And particularly we've seen industrial policy taking its prominence.
Sorry, you have your micro off. So people on Teams.
How about now? Maybe?
Okay,
Yeah?
yeah.
Okay, much better. Sorry everyone. Thank you for letting me know. So industrial policy is back again, and we've seen its rise during the COVID pandemic, with the governments getting involved to not only take care of people, but also to stimulate industry and innovation. We've seen the very specific case of development of COVID vaccines and how the governments got behind that. We saw how quick that can be, we saw how effective that can be when the motivation is there. We're also seeing the climate crisis getting the governments involved. So there are a lot of net zero policies. So Europe has the Green Deal, and we have seen a lot of government involvement there. But also, sadly, we see the war triggering a lot of industrial policy. And even if countries are not involved in the war, they are thinking about how the war might affect their countries, taking actions, for instance, to secure their global value chains or secure the energy markets and so on. Sorry. Yet, industrial policy remains really hard to get right. So a lot of things can go wrong with industrial policy. There are very fine balances. I just looked up some data. I thought it would be interesting to know a little bit more about what the industrial policy is doing in the last year. So this is recent data from IMF showing the industrial policy measures implemented in 2023, just in 1 year. You can see the light blue color on top is the amount of industrial policy in advanced economies, and then the dark blue at the bottom is the emerging economies. So there is a reversal in the trends. We are used to seeing more industrial policy used in development in emerging countries, but a lot more involvement in the advanced countries recently as well. Particularly the case of subsidies is discussed a lot in the literature, and I will come back to that. And Merce has talked about, my PhD supervisor Mariana, who's talking a lot about the involvement of the government, so I'll come to that in a second. But you can see that emerging countries use a lot of subsidies, and we will look into the specific purpose of subsidies as opposed to tax credits in the context of R&D. And finally, you can look at the reasons or the motivations for the use of industrial policy. Majority of the countries use it to trigger competitiveness in the industry. Climate change is triggering a lot of industrial policy. On the third line, you have the global value chain resilience with the disruptions, particularly starting from COVID period, but also with the war. Every country wants to secure their value chains and their supply chains, and geopolitical concerns and national security are the next two reasons. And of course, IMF is alarmed. This is from a recent article. The use of subsidies risks the trade wars. So if everybody is going into a protectionist zone, then there could be some reversal of the trends, for better or worse. So let's talk a little bit about R&D tax credits, R&D subsidies. This is probably, I'm probably preaching to the, the audience that knows this quite well, but they are the main reason behind using these policy tools, and they are supply-side policy instruments. They are there to kind of trigger the innovations, increase the innovations of companies. The main rationale is that technological externalities have, innovation has higher social returns than private returns. So there are some market failures. Companies, without the intervention of the government, they would not spend as much on R&D as they would with the interventions. So that legitimizes the government getting involved and supporting companies to spend more money on R&D. So the whole idea is to trigger private R&D spending, private innovations. Yet they are very different, R&D credits and R&D subsidies. So tax credits, these are ex post instruments. So a company spends on R&D and then they get tax credits back from the government. So in that way, the company is free to spend however much they want on R&D. They're also allowed to spend it on whatever R&D they want. So there is not a specification around it. In that way, R&D credits, R&D tax credits are considered to be market conforming. So they amplify whatever is happening in the market. They amplify the behavior of the firms. They just increase it. They put more money behind what the companies are doing. R&D subsidies are quite different. So this is where the government really takes a position on where R&D spending needs to happen and identify some strategically critical areas, such as, for instance, the net zero transition or healthy aging, for instance, the big one in the UK. So they identify these strategic areas and then they give companies money to do R&D. So it's the typical grants, R&D grants that we see. And they're ex-ante. The company doesn't need to spend any money on R&D to get it. So they are given a lump sum of money. So I'd like to emphasize the work of Mariana Mazzucato in this area. She talked about the entrepreneurial state taking the lead in terms of identifying what is essential and what's socially desirable to invest into as R&D, and then really getting behind that, developing it. And she talks about creating markets for these kinds of different technologies, different areas. So she actually says it's not right to think about market failures, because then if you think about market failures, the government's role is minimized. So you just go as the government and fix the market failure. Whereas if you are intervening with a strategic approach, you can grow markets, you can create markets from scratch, and that's a leadership and entrepreneurial role for the government. So subsidies are very much aligned with that kind of vision, and they are not market confirming. They change the composition of R&D overall for the company, for the country. And they really are different, these two instruments. The more you look into them, the more you realize how different they are. R&D tax credits are simple to implement. So the company spends X amount, comes back and claims whatever percentage they are allowed to claim from that. And it's relatively immune to political and institutional biases, is what the literature tells us. However, R&D tax credits really favor large companies because SMEs don't spend much on R&D. Their R&D is very informal, so they don't really benefit from tax credits very much. R&D subsidies, on the other hand, they are more costly to implement, and they can be more prone to inefficiencies and sometimes corruption, because there's the so-called picking winners problem. So you need to pick who gets a subsidy, you need to pick which area it's worth investing. So there's a lot of strategic decision making in there. And the literature talks about information asymmetries, making this selection difficult and sometimes challenging. There is rent-seeking behavior and lobbying that could happen from the companies, and there could be bureaucratic corruption, of course. The main advantage of it is it gives the government a lead role to really get behind socially desirable areas, socially and environmentally desirable areas. R&D subsidies, as I will talk in a minute, is also beneficial to SMEs, particularly in the so-called valley of death, when a startup is stuck without money and they would not actually be able to scale without some support from the government. We have a lot of R&D subsidies in the UK, and I look at, in some of my other work, I look at how startups, whether they benefit from R&D subsidies. I think UK startup sector would not exist without the subsidies that the government offers. It comes in small as well as large amounts. So if we look at literature on how the R&D tax credits affect innovation, the answer, as it always is context dependent, but there's a lot of evidence on that. For instance, there is this recent paper on the British firms that show that R&D tax credits have a positive impact on R&D levels and patents of British companies. And indeed, if you talk to large companies in the UK, they always say tax credits work, tax credit works. Very popular instrument in the UK. So there is some also recent evidence from Norway, Italy and France that shows that R&D tax credits triggered R&D intensity and new products in these countries. There is some evidence from Taiwan showing that R&D tax credits grow the R&D expenditure, so the input additionalities are there for Taiwan. But also there is some evidence that suggests they are not so effective. So for instance, in a sort of multi-country study, Brown et al. Find little impact. There is some impact, but it's fairly insignificant, of high-tech sectors around the world. From Norway, a 2012 study shows no impact on product innovations. It increases R&D, tax credits, but it doesn't necessarily increase the output additionality, so no increased product innovations or patents, so the tax credits get lost somewhere in the process. I think our interpretation of the literature on R&D tax credits is that it is actually very much dependent on which country you are looking at, which sector you are looking at, and which sizes you are looking at. It tends to work for large companies much better. If you look at the case of subsidies, the R&D subsidies, how they affect, again, quite mixed results that are indicating that it's context dependent. Typically works for SMEs, the subsidies. I think the amounts of subsidies are not worth much for large companies. There's a very interesting study that happened after the 2008 financial crisis looking at Germany, and shows that because Germany offered a lot of subsidies coming out of the crisis, and they show that the companies that received R&D tax credits significantly increased their R&D investments post-financial crisis. There is some evidence from Italy that shows that R&D subsidies increased patenting activity of Italian firms. However, there is a very similar study that uses the same data set and shows that actually, yes, there was some increase in patenting, but it wasn't enough to justify how much R&D subsidies were offered. So Catuzella and Vivarelli show that actually the R&D efficiency of the companies went down if they received subsidies. So quite mixed evidence. So this one is interesting, the next one, Yi et al. For us, because we also look at Chinese companies. They talk about the non-linear impact of R&D subsidies. If you give R&D subsidies have a positive impact on the R&D output of companies, but if you give too much, then you are not getting much value. So there is some decline beyond a certain sweet point. Again, in this related to subsidies, the literature tells us it's very dependent on characteristics of the receiving firms. So foreign firms and domestic firms react differently to subsidies. Also, there's some literature that talks about the one-off as well as continuous provision of subsidies. So showing that actually, if you are continuously offering subsidies to companies, you make them dependent after some time. So they argue you need to wean off companies at some point. Also, the size of the subsidies, how much money you give, is an important consideration and affects the impact of it. So what is less considered in the literature is how these policy instruments affect the novelty of innovation. People look at number of patents, they look at R&D, extra R&D companies spend, but they don't look at whether subsidies and tax credits affect incremental or radical innovations. And that's an important consideration, particularly for emerging countries where catching up is one of the objectives. So you would like ideally these policy instruments to trigger radical innovations that can have potential within domestic markets, but also beyond the domestic markets. Some literature exists there, mostly from the developed contexts. So for the UK, the R&D tax credits increase both domestic and overseas patents, and I will tell you in a bit, but we use domestic patents as indicator of incremental innovations and overseas patents as an indicator of radical innovations, and I'll come to the rationale behind that. But it's particularly R&D tax credits seem to trigger overseas patents significantly. Also for Canadian firms, R&D tax credits trigger radical innovations that are incremental and radical innovations that are new to the domestic markets, but also new to the international markets, overseas markets. And from Norway, R&D tax credits boost incremental innovations that are new to the firm, but they don't boost the radical innovations. And then finally, for UK SMEs, there is no significant impact on radical innovations. They only trigger incremental innovations. Quite mixed. In the developing context, R&D tax credits seem to generally help with radical innovations. So there aren't that many studies, but there's this one study about India. So India changed its R&D tax law, I think in 2022. They moved from giving 150% support to 200% support in 2021. And that change boosted not only R&D intensity, but both domestic and overseas patents, so helping with incremental and radical innovations. And then there's also some evidence from China, very recent evidence, showing that R&D tax credits help both domestic and incremental innovations, incremental and radical innovations, but more so the incremental innovations. So that leads me to my first hypothesis that talks about how R&D tax credits affect radical and incremental innovations. So I would expect R&D tax credits to have an impact on both, on the radical and incremental innovations. So if you remember, R&D tax credits apply to large companies mostly, and these are typically companies that have international potential, so they are more likely to go for radical innovations that will have impact in overseas markets. So personally, I see more of a inclination for these to drive overseas markets, mostly because they target large companies. But there is, I think, enough evidence in the literature that tells us it can also drive incremental innovations. The next one is how the R&D subsidies affect the nature of innovation. Very few people have done research in this area, and I think it's interesting. It's mostly from developed country contexts. So there is a Swiss study on R&D subsidies, and it argues that R&D subsidies also increase radical innovations. The firms are more likely to have radical innovations than radical product innovations. So there is also some evidence from Korean pharmaceutical industry that shows that subsidies drive radical innovations for that sector. And if you remember, these are very much specifically chosen by the governments. So governments will have national as well as international objectives. So we would expect along that line they will try to target both domestic and incremental innovations as well as international and overseas innovations. There's also a big literature and of course a policy understanding on mixing policies. So we talk about combination of policies that have an impact on innovation rather than single, and a lot of them come all at the same time. So we kind of want to look at how R&D tax credits and how R&D subsidies work. What happens when we mix these two different types of tools? On the one hand, if you want to go for radical innovations, these require a lot of investment. So you might as well pile on with all sorts of different policies you have to support innovation because they take long time, they are very risky, so you want to give a lot of support to them. On the other hand, there is a literature that talks about nonlinear impact, so there is maybe too much support beyond the sweet point. If you are giving more and more support, maybe it doesn't work so well, you're giving too much. Particularly if there are inefficiencies, if there are information asymmetries, regulatory biases, corruption, etc., then it can be more challenging to mix these things, and there could be more arguments for regulatory capture. However, we are kind of like starting with the safe hypothesis that there is not enough in the literature on the policy mixes about this. So we would expect these mixes, the joint implementation of these policies, to have an impact on both incremental and radical innovations. So that's the background of the paper, the literature. Then I'd like to tell you a little bit about the empirical focus of it. You're asking how the R&D tax credits and R&D subsidies affect the novelty of innovation in Chinese firms. The data for this is publicly listed A-share Chinese companies. So we've got more than 4,000 companies, 4,196 that are on the China stock market and accounting research. Also, my colleague Li Tao got some data from the annual reports of listed companies. So for some variables, and I will mention which ones, we didn't have data from this database, the CSMR database, so she hand collected some data, particularly on subsidies. And then we combined it with domestic patents data from the China's National Intellectual Property Administration. And now for overseas patents, we got that from, they are reported on the main CSMR database, but also we went to Google Patents to double check the number of overseas patents that the Chinese companies got. So I've been talking about radical and incremental innovations, and I've talked about overseas patents and domestic patents. So my proxy for incremental innovations is domestic patents, and my proxy for radical innovations is overseas patents. Now we've kind of like struggled with that, and I would welcome the opinions of the audience, whether this sits well with you. The literature tells us that radical innovations, so companies need radical and incremental innovations, and there might be different reasons for channeling these into domestic and international markets. But the main argument is that it's expensive to patent in many different overseas patent authorities. So if a patent is not significantly important to the company, they might register it just with the domestic patent office, but they are not going to take the effort to, and of course invest into registering it in overseas patents. So they are thinking that's sufficiently novel and will have potential in overseas markets, and hence we call it more radical. So I'm open to comments about that if there are any. And then in the paper we are using 3 policy instruments. The first one is the government's R&D subsidies. So these are grants that the government offers to companies, direct R&D grants. The third one, and I'll come back to the second one, the third one is your typical R&D tax credits. So this is the ex post, the company has spent on R&D tax credits, and then, on R&D, and the government gives them tax credits to be used next year. So in the China, it's 75% of R&D spending that they can get back in taxes. But if a company is a manufacturing company, they can get 100% of their R&D spending. And the first time I looked at this data, I thought, that's a lot, that's really a lot. But for instance, if you look at China, if you look at India, they are getting 150% to 200% of what they spend. So the government really doubles what the companies spend. So these are significant support systems for companies. So for the UK, we have tax credits, but it's not as substantial. I'm sure in Spain, I don't know the situation, but there's probably tax credits as well. The middle category is an interesting one, and we classify it as a tax credit, but it's an interesting one because it's for high and new technology enterprise tax deduction. So the company goes to the government and gets a certificate as a high-tech company. So once they certify, they can deduct their income tax, not R&D tax, but income tax. The rate goes from 25% to 10%, and this is one of the more recent policies that China has introduced in the I think last 15 years, and has they say it's been very successful in triggering innovations, particularly in certain zones. So for instance, they've got these technology zones. If the company is located there, it's very easy for them to get this certification, and then suddenly their tax rate is lower. So this is our data. We have, you can see the sources as well as the basic descriptive stats. The ones that I'd like to emphasize, so domestic and foreign patents, they are counts. We have not weighed these with patent citations, which would be really useful to account for the variation in the quality of the patents. But this data is very difficult to gather and process, so we are going with simple patents. We have data on innovation subsidies, and this is reported in the company accounts. We have data on the total tax deductions if they've got the second policy, the high-tech firm tax deduction, 10%. What we didn't have was the R&D credits, how much R&D credits the company got. So this is really nice data that was hand collected. We collected, my colleague collected it, and we have the amount of R&D tax credits for each of these companies that we are looking at. So we control for size, the assets liability ratio, R&D profit, as well as the industry concentration to account for industrial differences. So what we are looking at in the paper is how these three policies have an impact on the patenting of the companies, both overseas as well as domestic. And for methodology, we are using propensity score matching, commonly used in the policy literature to see how a policy has an impact on the treated companies, on the companies that have benefited from the company. So we have, it's a quasi-experimental method, and we are kind of matching the companies that have received a treatment with a control group. So we have 7 treatments. They get an innovation subsidy, a high-tech firm tax, and a credits, R&D credit. But we also look at how they, what happens when they get 2 of these, any 2 of these, as well as all of them. And now we are looking at the average treatment effect on the treated. So what happens to companies that receive a certain type of policy support. So we are matching the companies based on size, liability, R&D, and profit characteristics, and we are employing the nearest neighbor matching methods. We did all the necessary controls to make sure that this works, and fortunately they all seem to work fine. And we have some t-tests, etc. And I'd like to show you what we find for the specific cases. So let's start with the domestic patents, the incremental patents. Innovation subsidies seem to have a, how am I doing on time?
It's 20 minutes.
Okay, so maybe I need 5 more minutes. Do I have it? Okay. So innovation subsidies, actually all 3 elements, all 3 innovation policies we have are able to increase incremental innovation. This is good. And then if you look at the combinations of policy mixes at the bottom, they're also working on incremental innovation. So policy is good for incremental innovation. That's really good news to start with. For overseas patents, the situation is a bit more challenging, and these are radical innovations, and we know radical innovations are more difficult. So policy seems to miss in some places. Particularly the subsidies don't really work well with radical innovations. They don't trigger radical innovations. But the other 2 tax variables, they seem to increase radical innovations. And then if you look at the policy mixes, generally the tax variables work well, but once you combine taxes with subsidies, that doesn't seem to have as strong of an effect on tax credits, on overseas patents. We also did some robustness checks because using patents as a dependent variable, these have very skewed distributions, so we use some zero-inflated negative binomial models to look at domestic patents. You can see that the results are roughly similar, so all policy instruments seem to work well for domestic patents. It's hit or miss when it comes to radical patents. Mostly, so these are the policy mixes. If you mix taxes with subsidies, it doesn't work so well. And for radical innovations, you can see subsidies are again not working very well. And again, the one that seems to consistently work well for radical innovations is R&D tax credits. This middle way where the government chooses who's a high-tech firm and gives them some income tax, so the second variable there, the HTF tax, that has mixed performance, maybe reflecting on the nature of that instrument. And then on the policy mix, we again find if you are crossing taxes with subsidies, it doesn't seem to work so well with the radical innovations. So very quickly, going back to the findings, not only are these instruments, R&D tax and R&D subsidy instruments are different, but also they have different implications. So this is the case of China, but it would be interesting to look at, for instance, developed contexts, other emerging contexts. There seems to be a preference for R&D tax credits to drive radical innovations. They seem to work well, and that could be the association of R&D tax credits working for large businesses. But R&D subsidies are effective typically in driving incremental innovations that are appropriate for the domestic markets. And this thing I mentioned about R&D tax credits versus high-tech firm credits, it seems that the pure market-based instrument is performing better than this mixed instrument, the hybrid instrument, in the case of radical innovations. So policy implications, it's really important to not only think about the amount of innovation in devising and designing innovation policy instruments. It's also important to think about the nature of innovations we want to trigger, because there is a place for incremental innovations, but ideally, if this is money well spent, it should also be unlocking innovations where they are most necessary, but also unlocking quite radical innovations that wouldn't happen without intervention. Radical innovations may still benefit from mixing R&D subsidies and tax credits, but we have a caution there to be careful because it's not always working so well. So I'd like to thank everyone for your attention, and I don't remember if I mentioned it, but this is the first time I'm presenting the paper, so it's the first time we are socializing it. I would very much welcome all sorts of comments about the context, the estimation methods, and everything. And yeah, up to you for questions.
Okay. So, thank you very much. Questions?
Probably in this field, in this topic.
Austin, no utilizzes el micro del centre més de classe. Sí, agafar el micròfon.
El micròfon
On el tenim?
No?
És
utilitzat per la
Està allí. Sí.
Shall I give you this?
No, it is here. I've kidnapped it.
Tampoc no es vendrà res. Probably one of the key of this topic is the balance between the additional effect and the displacement effect, no? And considering that you have a temporal panel, no? this balance, no, entre displacement and additional, vary across the economic cycle, no? Do you analyze these
No.
chunks over the cycle or no?
No.
But it's a nice question, no?
Yeah, it's a very nice question. How would you, like, what's your suggestion? Can you expand a little bit on what might be like an interesting application?
An explanation can be the interest of this question. It is perhaps the counter-cyclical strategy that the governments may apply to this kind of policies. So, in terms of the... O sigui, pregunta quin és el motiu de l'anàlisi cíclic.
No, I think that during the increasing fast, no, probably the increase the additional effect for me, no, is my intuition, no, and during the slowdown fast, probably the displacement effect is more important, no.
Yes.
And I think this link is interesting for the future research, no,
Yeah.
not in the present.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about the longitudinal dimension of it, but that's something we can look at because we've got about 10 years. And there is some change, I guess, coming out of the financial crisis in China's.
But the panel is a balanced panel or unbalanced?
It's not balanced.
It's not balanced.
It's not balanced. It's not balanced. But very good comment. I'll have a think about it. Thank you.
Related with this point, do you control for time damage?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. At empirical level, perhaps, I don't know if you can control non-applicants among the difference between applicants that they have obtained a refusal of the subsidies and those ones that they are not applicants, because this is also a topic.
Yes.
Inside the literature,
The selection.
yes,
bias.
selection
Unfortunately, we don't have application data. We have grant data, so it's looking at the survivors of that. Unfortunately,
Okay.
yeah, that's a good point.
But you can observe is that if the firm introduces a patent but not gets the subsidy, so you can. It's not the same, but it's a way to approximate. An innovative firm not getting the subsidy, maybe that's interesting.
Okay, yeah. Were you talking about subsidies or patents in terms of application? You were talking about subsidies, right?
Me? Yes. Yes, subsidies.
But you have a
Patents.
follow-up idea, yeah, interesting. We haven't controlled for either, application, neither on the patent side nor on the subsidy or tax credit side. I guess the tax credits are automatic. You get them, you register and you get them. It's the subsidies where they would be significant. They would have significant bias. So it's some good ideas.
Okay, I don't know if you've used the bounding approach to check whether your results are sensitive to hidden biases. I think if you do that, you can be able to support more the argument that although you don't have the data for this, your results are not so sensitive to hidden biases.
Yeah, we did some sensitivity analysis. What kind of factors do you recommend?
Okay, so you can use the Rosenbaum,
Yeah.
which after a certain threshold, maybe 1 or 1.2, then
But how does that relate to the selection issue?
okay, so with the bounding approach, it says that your firms, they self-select into tax credits,
Yeah.
for example. So those who are receiving the tax credits are firms that have certain characteristics.
Yeah.
So the results you are getting are dependent on self-selection. So what the bounding approach says is that although like what I'm getting could be biased, it's like causality is still, you can still assume some sort of causality.
Yeah,
Basically.
very good suggestion, thank you.
Concerning the measure between domestic and international patents, also a way of measuring perhaps the radical densities with the citations.
Citations, yeah. So that I would welcome recommendations on that. I think that's ideally how we would do it, because that would really tell us whether they are radical or not. It's just really a whole other piece of work to match that to citation. So we've shied away from it for that reason. But do you find do you find how we interpret it as reasonable? Because we have been very much between, are we talking about innovations for the domestic market, or are we talking about incremental innovations? And you can have radical and incremental innovations for the domestic markets, but you will mostly have radical for overseas markets.
For me, it's
it makes sense to you?
It makes sense, yes.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Because we had a lot of internal debates and discussions on whether that makes sense or not. Especially for the case of China. So if you look at, for instance, some sectors like solar, they are the country with the most advanced technology. So their patents will be radical, but they might be, applied to the domestic as well as international patents. So or batteries, for instance, in some areas, the difference between international and domestic markets may not be that significant. So we've been debating that, and I feel like at some point we'll have to go get the citations to be absolutely sure that they are what they are.
Okay.
Yes.
I think we're done now. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.